Okay, we're doing it. So welcome to the Dharma talk called Cultivating a Compassionate Witness. Um, and yeah, so I feel like talks are always hmm, more helpful for me when the person who's giving the talk talks about their personal relationship to it. So that's what I'm gonna do. So the idea for this talk came really directly out of something that I'm working with right now. Um, it has a lot to do with how part of my kind of development as a teenager and young adult. So if you really knew me, you would know that I've been in therapy since I was about 16 years old, and even a couple of years before that, but it was not in a row, just kind of more random. And therapy for me has really been a godsend. It helped me out of a bad friendship circle. It helped me believe in myself and go to college. And since I started therapy really young, many of my therapists really acted like they were kind of additional parents. And so, how I treated therapists, like well into my 30s, was that they were um, experts on what I needed, on my experience, on my life, and it was really problematic. There's a way that it was appropriate at the time, and then became kind of not so helpful. Yo, I think I got something in my eye. I'm like, I can feel it. Anyway, we'll see how it goes. I'm like got this like strange little blur going across. Anyway, um so I don't think that I consciously knew that I was making therapists the expert on my life and me just a kid, 30 years old, who didn't know any better. But I began to realize this pattern when I started hiding my dating choices from my therapists. I was worried that my therapist at the time would judge me. And ultimately, when I did decide that I wanted to tell her who I was dating and what the relationship was like, she slid right into the role and she said, "Oh, Devin, you don't want to date him, do you?" And she said I didn't want to date him, so I guess I didn't want to date him. Sorry, I'm gonna see if I can get this thing out. Um, And since I felt like she was the expert on what was right, I cut the guy off right then. And it wasn't because I was ready to cut him off or because I wanted to break up with him. It was because it was what was right. And, of course, this created like a whole mess of problems. And also because when I'm not being true to my own experience, there's a way that, it was like a lot of like breaking up, getting back together, breaking up, getting back together, because I was not actually listening to myself. I was listening to someone else and then trying to like superimpose that onto myself, and my sense was that like they knew better, and then I'd just like be in this deep struggle against like what I actually wanted, because I'm like, well, they know best and I don't know anything about my experience. So it was like this created this huge internal conflict, and I noticed that I was stuck in this really unhelpful dynamic where my therapist was right and I needed to follow instructions, and that I had really outsourced what was right for me. And I bring this up because the process of owning my own life and experience as mine, guided from the inside, has really shown me how powerful the compassionate witness is in life, but also in practice, and when we are attempting something new, tender, and important. And so that's what I want to talk about today. In our practice, and we'll talk starting with meditation practice, in our practice, we are asked to watch our experience, right? So, like in mindfulness, it's like watching the experience, but it would be a very dry practice if we were just like breathing in and breathing out, thought, like all of that. There's a whole internal world that's happening. And oftentimes, Especially when we begin to practice, what we notice is that like we are actually pretty harsh judges of ourselves. And so we recognize pretty quickly that watching isn't enough, that actually, in order to have a practice um, that can kind of reach the depth that we can see oftentimes on our teachers and mentors, where like, oh, it's like, wow, practice can get so deep and so beautiful. I mean, I remember the first time that I saw a Sylvia Boorstein, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was 16 years old at that time, started Buddhism and therapy at the same time. um I was like, oh my gosh, she's so bright. Like she's got this like twinkle in her eye. And she was talking about some really hard stuff, but like she didn't lose the twinkle. So there was like some sense that there was something really kind of special and magical here about like that like long-term practice. And so like there's a way that, at least for me, there was that connection of like, okay, like the depth gets reached by doing something very different than I'd been doing before. And so we, we begin just by watching our mind. And oftentimes, again, like I said, hearing the intensity of our own judgment. And it's like, and it's funny because like we start practice, and oftentimes we start practice because we're in a place of suffering, right? Like not a lot of people come here because things are going really well for them. Most people come because there's some sort of a challenge. And we sit, and then it's like someone turns up the volume on these like super rude, judgmental things that we say to ourselves that oftentimes we're just not aware of that are there. Um, and so when we talk about cultivating not only the seeing, but a compassionate, curious seeing, it really is in many ways a totally different way of being with ourselves. And so, how do we do it? And I think the first part for me that feels really important is that we don't have to demonize the judgmental mind. I call this sneaky compassion, because we're already beginning to be compassionate with ourselves by not demonizing our judgmental mind. It's like we don't have to make an enemy of our judgmental mind. We can also hold that with compassion. It's like our goal is to be compassionate towards ourselves, and then like there's these like little sneaky ways we can sneak in compassion. So the judgmental mind is there, and my sense is that it's played a role for many of us, and that actually it was even helpful at one time. And so our job in relationship with the judgmental mind is to come to peace with the fact that it exists. This exists. Judgments arise. This is part of being human. I, would rather it not operate in the way it's operating, but like it was helpful at one time, and now I'm working on doing it different. And we can have compassion for the part of ourself that feels hurt and judged by the responses and the narration of the judgmental mind. But the beautiful thing about compassion is that we see that actually nothing is excluded from it. So we bring in the judgmental mind, we bring in the parts that feel hurt by the judgmental mind. And then, so right, like that kind of sets the stage. And then we can do practices. And if you've practiced with me before, this is familiar to you. We can do practices where we actually really intentionally like build in the phrase, welcome home, honey, every time it's time to come back, or we've recognized that we've wandered and it's time to come back. Welcome home, honey. And so it's like, instead of like waiting for the judgmental mind to start narrating, we go, I'm actually just going to like slip in. I was going to say tape deck. I was born in 1979. So, that's how it goes. We put in the tape deck or the CD or Spotify or whatever the heck you relate to. And so whenever it comes back, whenever we realize like, oh, I'm wandering, it's like, that's the thing that we're going to say. And it begins to build this neuronal pathway that the more we walk it, the easier it is for us to access it. The more we do it, the better we get at it, right? Practice, practice, practice. And so we can do those type of practices to begin to sort of allow the compassionate witness to kind of like, it's a little bit of a running start. It's like, okay, we're going to like bring in this compassion here. And it might not necessarily be like some homegrown compassion, but I'm going to just like put this tape in, press play, and this is how we're going to do it. The other days, like, because sometimes some practices don't work so well, like, and it doesn't mean like they never work. It just means like sometimes some practices don't work. And then, you try them a week later and, it's mind blowing. And then some days it's just like, I'm not really feeling this. So another one that I really like is bringing in another person to respond to you. So it's still us. But there's something about bringing in a loving other that can really help us to get out of the patterned judgmental responses that we have. And this can be a person that we know and love, who loves us, or it can be like a spiritual figure that reminds you of unconditional love. I think Enrique, when he was just leading the practice, said something like loving awareness. Like, all right, I'm going to bring in loving awareness to just like watch this practice. And like the ways that we can sometimes feel like we can't access or we fall short, all of a sudden loving awareness is like, welcome home, honey. Like, oh, it's hard right now. Oh, your mind keeps going back to trying to figure that out. Of course it does. You just come on back. Enjoy this. Sit here, be. And when you wander, you wander. And so it allows us to kind of reach into this depth of what we imagine a compassionate witness would be. And what happens is that this imagining someone different, the more we walk that path, the more it becomes our voice. And those places that were hard for our compassionate witness to reach, or like maybe we don't even feel like we had a compassionate witness, but like the places that felt hard to reach before, now we're embodying. Now we're embodying that love and that kindness. And so, like I said, the more that we do this and practice it, the more that we create these pathways. And so we practice. And another sneaky compassion is to know that we'll fall off, and that's actually to be expected. That part of a growth process is that we're going to have times where we're shitty and judgmental, and that actually that's part of this. I used to work at Challenge Day where Enrique works now, and at the end, we talk about like, oh, like creating this new habit of how to be with each other. And one of the examples is a baby learning how to walk. So when a baby is learning how to walk, and I'm making the connection with when a person is trying to create a compassionate witness, when a baby is learning how to walk, they stand up and they fall down, and then they stand up and they fall down, and they keep going. But if every time the baby fall down, they were like, fuck this, it's not for me, fuck this walking shit, I quit. It's like, we would be in a very different place as a people. And I just realized, is that ableist? I guess not everybody can walk. Anyway, it's some good thing for me to notice. But I think that the idea here is that what I really want to point to is that we will fall off. And so our compassionate witness can hold the fact that we fall off. And it's like, oh, you fell off. Come back. Come on back. You're welcomed home. Like there's no way that we begin to sort of be outside or do something that puts us outside of like, we're not exiled. We won't exile ourselves. The compassionate witness doesn't exile. So that's kind of more on the sort of meditation practice, but I also want to talk about the life part of it. So when we are watching ourselves, we all have patterns that are really hard for us to watch ourselves do, and we do it anyway. All of us. So that's good news. You're among amazing company. But there's a reason that we struggle with what we struggle with. We've experienced things in our lives that have set us up to struggle in a specific way, oftentimes unintentionally, oftentimes passed on from our family. And this is our life. And if we're going to grow in our life, having a compassionate witness to watch us do a little bit of a rinse repeat cycle is actually pretty important to our growth process. I've been reading a book. Well, I've been listening to it. That's just the whole truth. I've been listening to a book called No Bad Parts. And I wish I knew what the author's name is, but he's the guy who started Internal Family Systems. And it was super interesting to hear him talk about the ways that we view these parts of ourselves that we struggle with, and oftentimes the way that we view other people. And so he talked about, like, he's like, if you believe that an addict has an irresistible urge to use drugs, then you might try to fight against that part of the addict that has this urge, and then ensue the power struggle in these parts, the part that wants to use drugs, and the part that doesn't want them, the person to use drugs, and then it's like a game, it's like a willpower, like a battle of wills. And if we can see the part, right, conversely, if we can see the part that seeks drugs as protective, and that the burden of this part is to keep this person from feeling severe emotional pain or even suicidality, then we treat the person very differently. We might honor that part. And so I would love to invite us, even just for a moment, to think about the parts of us that are so hard for us and go, what if this thing that I do that's so challenging for me is actually protective and has actually at some point been functional, and that it's helped me survive? The way that we might work with this part of ourselves, even if it's really challenging, might open us to that sense of a compassionate witness. Where it's like, what's going on here, right? Then the curiosity comes online. What's happening here? Why am I doing this thing that's so challenging for me? And yet I keep doing it. But the only way we stop doing it, instead of judging it, is to get curious about it, because there's something that is functional about it, even if it feels really dysfunctional. It's interesting because he talked about, when I think about the title No Bad Parts, the author talked about like the extent of his work. And he says, he quotes somebody, of course, I forget who he quoted, but it was something like, I've never met a part that I didn't like. And this guy worked with murderers. And he talks about how, as he would work with these men who had committed murder, and, my best friend was murdered when I was 21 years old. So, like, it's not an uncomplex, like, person to be, but here we go. Oftentimes when people are acting in these ways, it's rooted in early childhood trauma, and they themselves have been the victims of abuse and violence, right? And he listened. He says that he'd set up his therapy room so that, like, each part had, like, a chair, and that they could go in between these parts. And what he said they found is that, like, as they listened to these parts that were murderous, that this person had who had been on the receiving end of violence and abuse had created a protector part that became desperate to protect them from abuse. And from that point on, though, that part took on the hatred to punish innocence and vulnerability, or, like fill in the blank. And that part was frozen in time. And that part, that protector part that never wanted to be the victim again, would victimize other people and victimize themselves. And that in doing this work, right, in inviting in the murderous part of people who have murdered or had murdered, he worked with folks in the past, that there was a way that that compassionate witness could expand, right? It's like the curiosity, the understanding, to know this part. Can you imagine how much courage it takes to know that part? I don't know, it just feels so brave, right? He's like, all right, we're going to do this work. For the person to know the part, for him to know the part, like it has to be held by that compassionate witness. And so we have this opportunity, right? Instead of exiling the parts that we struggle with, we are actually invited to engage them. Or we can find a friend if it's like too much for us, or a therapist. So often the parts that we struggle with just desperately need this compassionate witness. They need to be known. They need to be heard. And when we hold the perspective that all parts of us have helped us survive, we're able to hold back from demonizing them. And when we begin to get curious about why they're there and their role and what it's been, we can work towards healing. And so I started this story, or this talk, with a story. And I think that this is where that initial story kind of closes the loop. And I'm recognizing we're about time, so I'll move forward. So I started with thinking every therapist knew better about me than me. And actually, I started like thinking that everyone knew more about what I should do than me. And once I realized that that was really problematic and that it was like very present in me, I was interested in working with this hypothesis that maybe I'm trustworthy. And although my mind over and over and over again in pretty much every situation, well, I'll say this, my mind has collected a lot of data that I'm untrustworthy, that I make shitty decisions. But I began working with a therapist who was really committed to not telling me what to do, but rather giving me the space to make decisions, to make mistakes, to engage fully in the process of learning to trust myself. And it's true that while I was engaging in this journey to trust myself, that compassionate witness really needed to be there, because I made a lot of mistakes, right? You think about it. I married my ex-wife. But it was also true that as my compassionate witness could be there and be present and watch the relationship kind of disintegrate, that I left. And that is really trustworthy. And that throughout this process of me and my growth, because I could allow myself this progress and this intimacy and this curiosity about what was going on, and I didn't need perfection, I began to actually hear my own voice because I'd been curious, because I'd been interested. And I was like, whatever I hear, I'm just going to hold this with a lot of tenderness. And so, yeah, it's a brave thing to do, to be willing to witness with compassion our internal world. But, I guess like my deepest wish is like, may we have the courage to ask ourselves and all of our parts to sit down and talk And may we listen and understand that there are no bad parts, just parts that are trying their best to help us survive. And may this understanding help us to continue deepening this curiosity and kindness, because it's what we all deserve. Yeah.
That's what's up right there.